Все, трансляцию включили.
The broadcast is on now. Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear guests, let me declare the session of the Dissertation Council on the defense of Kotur Mladen's dissertation on the topic low temperature nuclear spin-lattice relaxation in n-Gallium arsenide that is defended to seek the degree of the kind of science, physics and mathematics in the specialism 01.04.10 physics of semiconductors. I declare the session open. By the decree of St. Petersburg State University dated the 4th of October 2016, I, Vadim Fadeyevich Agikan, Doctor of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, Professor of the Department of Physics of Solid Body, St. Petersburg State University, has been appointed chairman of this dissertation council. I would like to now announce the names of the members of the dissertation council. Agikan Vadim Fadeyevich, professor of the Department of Physics of the Solid Body, the chairman of the dissertation council. Sergei Yurovich Verbin, professor of the Department of Physics of Solid Body. Vivenko Oleg Fedorovich, professor of the Department of Electronics of the Solid Body. Tatiana Vasilyevna Shubina, Chief Research, Physical and Technical Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dmitry Robertovich Yakovlev, Professor, Technical University of Dortmund, Germany. I remind you that according to federal law on science and state scientific and technical policy, St. Petersburg State University got the right to confirm the degrees of scientific degrees and relevant degree of St. Petersburg State University was issued in St. Petersburg State University, on the basis of which we are conducting this session, and the session is valid if no more than two-thirds of the dissertation council members are present and not fewer than 4 members, 4 people. Our dissertation council consists of 5 members. Everybody is present, so therefore the quorum is there. And so this is the procedure of the dissertation council. A session, it should not last more than 2 hours, and we have the following items on our agenda: short presentation of the chairman of the dissertation council on the paperwork that has been submitted by to the dissertation council, and possible answers to questions, and this will last for 5 minutes, and maybe announcing, and then the short report of the defendant for 15 minutes, questions to the defendant on the topic of his presentation on more than 2 minutes per question, answers of the defendant, then the chairman voices the reviews. All the reviews were uploaded to the website of St. Petersburg State University, therefore only critical points are actually read out. And then number 5, members of the dissertation council take turns with reading their reviews and with questions and critiques addressed to the defendant, not more than 10 minutes per review. Then there will be answers from the defendant. Open discussion comes next, and then there will be a 5-minute break after that. After the final questions, not more than 5 minutes, then there will be a presentation of of the scientific advisor of the defendant, not more than 5 minutes. Then there will be a break of 5 minutes before the open voting procedure for the members of the Dissertation Council to discuss their verdict. And then after that, the broadcast will be resumed, and then open voting will take place. And then I would like to say that simultaneous interpretation is provided, and therefore this is the agenda, and I would like now to start going through items. The dissertation of Mladen Kotur on the topic low temperature nuclear spin-lattice relaxation in n-Gallium arsenide was presented to seek the degree of the kind of physical and mathematical sciences in the specialism 010410 physics of semiconductors. It was received for defense and approved by the decree of the academic secretary of St. Peter's State University, dated on the 4th of October 2017. Also, the Dissertation Council was approved by the decree of the academic secretary of St. Peter's State University on the same date. The defendant presented the following documents, submitted the following documents. First, personal declaration to the rector of the St. Peter's State University, asking to review and allow to defend the dissertation. And then the review of the academic advisor of the candidate of physical mathematical sciences, chief researcher of Yofi Institute, Mr. Kavokin. Then the list of publications that consists of 3 papers that cover the main key aspects of the dissertation that are published in Scopus Index publications, and there also a certificate about the passing all the relevant examinations through the course of postgraduate course at Yofi Institute, translation of the degree document of higher education that was issued by Belgrade University, then the dissertation in Russian and in English in hard copy and soft copy. And also, I would like to say that this complies with the standards for dissertation. And now I would like to give the floor to the defendant to do the presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of my dissertation is low temperature nuclear spin-lattice relaxation in n-Gallium arsenide. How can I switch over the slides? Okay, good. So what we did, we measured the T1 time in metallic and dielectric stages, and we also looked at how those change depending on the temperature. We suggested a specific protocol based on optic orientation. The motivation is that the nuclear spin is a tool for information storage, and therefore we need to have data on 2 important processes. Those are spin polarization and relaxation. To this end, we looked at nuclear spin relaxation without pumping and in weak down to 0 magnetic fields. Gallium arsenide is the second most widely used type of semiconductor after silicon. It is very well studied. However, the relaxation processes in weaker fields have not yet been investigated so far. So on this slide you can see the description of the experiment and the description of the samples. The third sample are the metal phase. The thickness is 1 micron. This was the microstructure, whereas the latter geometric structures were the initial samples. So you see the structure and the polarization data for each sample. The metallic sample is a heterostructure. This is the gallium arsenide as well. We resorted to two effects. Those are the Handler effect, which is the depolarization of luminescence by a transverse magnetic field, and the DNP, which is transfer of angular momentum from electrons to nuclei via hyperfine interaction. We see that the dependency on the symmetric field is symmetric. Once there is a continuous sigma plus polarization, then the electron is affected by the nuclear and the external fields. Depending on the polarization, the field may change when they are parallel, or when the nuclear field compensates the external field, we see a maximum. The magnetic field with the most sensitive polarization is the DNP field. So the temperatures were from 2 to 30 Kelvin. The magnetic field was from 0 to 1200 Gauss. And here you see the data on the excitation wavelength. The pumping process and the relaxation and the measurement of relaxation depending on time. The first stage is the pumping of the nuclei when the sample is affected by a circular gravitation field. And then we measure the relaxation time, T1. Then we switch on the light and measure the magnetic light and look at how the polarization depends on time. Once the dark interval is very short, the nuclear polarization is preserved. When the light is on, the electron is affected by the nuclear and the external field without any changes in polarization. But once this interval is quite long, the nuclear polarization is not there, and when the light is switched on, the electron is affected by the external magnetic field only. But with the nuclear pumping, the polarization depends on time in a different way. What was important for us is to measure this time span. And this allows us to imagine how the nuclear field depends on the time interval. And this is described by a specific function that allows us to define the T1 time. Next slide shows the results for dielectric gallium arsenide samples. On this chart, you see the dependency between the nuclear field and the dark interval. And thus, we have a set of times that allows us to have the dependency, the reverse dependency between the temperature and the nuclear field for sample 1 and sample 2. The shortest time span, 20-30 seconds, increase with magnetic field up to 200 seconds. The relaxation speed in magnetic field with magnetic field unchanged can be described by the spin diffusion mechanisms, which means that the nuclei that are close to the donor center lose the spin by way of interaction with electrons. This mechanism is inefficient for nuclei that are far from the donor center, and thus there is no equilibrium in polarization. This means that the spin diffusion is on towards the donor center. Once we calculate the times, by using these equations, we see that the experimental tolerance is within the experimental data. Regrettably, this mechanism cannot explain the increase in velocity and the dependency between relaxation and the decreased magnetic field. Therefore, we suggested the relaxation model. The T1 time includes a spin diffusion and general relaxation. The first is when the magnetic field is larger than the local field, and this latter is when the magnetic field is lower than the magnetic field. The nuclear fields interact with magnetic fields in case there is no pumping. In high temperatures, the quadrupole relaxation is the relaxation due to the interaction of nuclear quadrupole moments with fluctuating electric field. Charge fluctuations induced by thermal activation of donor-bound electrons to the conduction band or due to hopping to empty donors. These fields cover the entire volume. The local electric fields can be created by positive electric charges of donor centers and by negative charges of localized electrons. So the latter two fields can be presented by way of local fields. When the magnetic field is increasing, this mechanism is subdued. Here we see how the relaxation velocity depends on the correlation time of fluctuating a dielectric field. The first can be defined as the averagely for the first sample and for the second sample, those stand at approximately 8 Gauss. This is slightly over what we see with the local field, which depends on the dipole interaction. And this means that there is an extra effect due to the quadrupole interaction. On this chart, you can see the characteristic fields obtained by photoluminescence procedure or the spin noise. On the next slide, I'll show the results for metallic gallium arsenide. Here you see how the nuclear field depends on the time span, and thus we have the T1 for different temperatures. And this is the dependency between the relaxation speed and the temperatures for dielectric and spin fields. The relaxation speed changes with the magnetic field increased, and ultimately it is beyond this dependency. The invariance of relaxation speed is explained by Keringer mechanism, which is fluctuating field produced by conduction electrons at the nucleus. Once we calculate the time spans by Keringa equation, we see that at temperatures over 10 degrees, this is compatible with the initial values. Thus, we have the structure of the dependency between the temperature and the velocity. This is a linear dependency, and it is in conformity with Keringa equation. The relaxation time at 80-85 degrees is different from what is theoretically viable by way of Keringa equation. This is due to the fact that at lower temperatures, there are specific electron condition zones and a spin diffusion, which means that nuclei relax sufficiently. With the increase in temperature, there is a transformation into the Keringa regime. Next, this is how the magnetic field decreases, and we see a faster relaxation. We see 3 sets of faster relaxation. In this case, we can use the quadrupole method for dielectric samples, or rather we cannot use it, because fluctuating fields are shielded by gas, and the suppression mechanism is more intense, standing at approximately 15 degrees and increasing with temperature. This is exactly what you see on the chart. These are the fields obtained by spin noise method and an array of other methods, and including the photoluminescence method. For many samples, the value is lower than for microzoning structures. The difference is vast due to the quadrupole deformation. So, defended statements for dielectric gallium arsenide as strong magnetic fields. B is larger than BL. Nuclei lose to the donor centers. They lose their polarization very efficiently due to the hyperfine interaction with localized electrons. This mechanism is ineffective for peripheral nuclei, which relax due to the spin diffusion towards the donors. Thus, dominance of the diffusion-limited hyperfine relaxation is confirmed. For dielectric gallium arsenide at weak magnetic fields, spin-lattice relaxation is dramatically accelerated due to the nuclear spin warm-up induced by fluctuating donor charges via the quadrupole interaction. For metallic gallium arsenide in magnetic fields above 50 GaAs, it was observed that the relaxation rate is invariant to change of external magnetic field and that it changes linearly with temperature. Such behavior confirms the validity of the Keringa theory for this range of magnetic fields. It is experimentally found that in metallic gallium arsenide at weak magnetic fields, nuclear spin-lattice relaxation strongly deviates from the predictions of Keringa theory. Similarly to dielectric phase, relaxation is suppressed with increasing the magnetic field, but the characteristic magnetic field is larger than local fields and is temperature dependent. Such a behavior suggests that some role in nuclear spin relaxation in metallic semiconductors is played by localized electron states. My research was published in 3 articles and 3 papers. So thank you very much for attention. Thank you for your report. Questions from the audience? Do members of the audience have any questions for the report? Please take turns. Mladen, this is my question. When you analyzed quadrupole interaction, did you assess the dielectric samples? They were volumetric samples, right? But did you assess their behavior in terms of the mechanic fields and quadrupole interaction? Yes, indeed, those can interact, and those can be dependent on the electromotive force and the voltage. My question is about your experimental setup. The very important thing in the experimental setup is the switch over time of the magnetic field. What was the inertia in your system? The speaker is not speaking in the microphone. The microphone was off. Well, the magnetic field was switched over to the dark field over the time less than 1 second. And to this end, we did the following thing. Once we opened the field, we had to hold for less than a second, so that to allow for the switch over. But once the time was less than 1 second, that was no problem. We used the term metallic phase, although the concentration at room temperature is about a real semiconductor. And you do not have to speak about any metallic properties here. What do you mean by metallic phase? And at what temperature is it achieved? Yes, indeed. Here we mean the following thing. Due to the fact that the concentration is over than the critical range, the delocalized electron is there even at such temperatures. And this means that for temperatures, for this experiment setup, there is delocalized electron. Yes, indeed, conduction is there, but the metallic phase in semiconductors means that this is the phase that is corresponded to the electron gas in metals. But once you have no conductivity, no expressed conductivity, and the saturation of electrons is high, this is a semiconductor, it is not a conductor. This is my question. You mean that you have high conductivity, but you cannot say that this is a metallic conductivity, because a metallic conductivity means that this is electron gas, right? Well, I know that the density in the conductivity area is lower once the temperature is lower. And therefore, if the temperature is very low, then you see the decay. So what did you observe at your samples? Well, I think that there is a formula. This question is really intriguing, but because what you see is that at 10 colors, you see a shift in the temperature dependency. What's the reason behind that? Is it the decay of gas, or your explanation is correct? So you do not consider the spin properties of a decayed or a non-decayed gas are different after all. But once we see the Keringa feature there, this means that this is a decayed gas. because the Keringa principle is for degenerated electrons. More questions? Thank you. My question is just is about being curious. Do you know anything about the spin relaxation of aluminium? Well, aluminium, arsenide, gallium, those are just very similar samples. So the influence is not ultimate. I know that this is not what was declared in your research, but after all, I'm just being curious about the behavior of aluminium. Or is it just beyond the scope of your research? Thank you. Yes. I just wanted to provide a follow-up to the question of the previous speaker. At high concentration, you see that the donor area coincides with the conductivity area, right? Yes, that's right. Okay. Are there any more questions of the members of the dissertation board? Good. No questions. I see no questions.
Are there any takers from the audience who'd like to have you registered? Has anyone registered for a speaking opportunity? Well, then we're happy to give the floor to members of the Dissertation Council to read out their reviews. Yes, you are the first, according to the alphabet. I say in my review that this is a very active experimental research, and they started in this 1970s, in the last century, and currently we study semiconductor nanostructures rather, but in this research it's shown that not everything is studied in terms of volume crystals, and so these experiments are worthy of study. And so the relaxation study is not only derives from research interest, but because spin memory can be used in practical applications like spin electronics, for example. The determination of mechanisms of polarization and the influences of temperature and the external field on this and the qualities of the semiconductors are very important. And so this is very studied in relation to the crystals of gallium arsenide, and within the context of low temperature nuclear spin-lattice relaxation. Well, in this regional research, when he talks about the velocity of the spin relaxation of gallium arsenide, it says that the time for relaxation increases by an order, and also the diffusion of the nuclear spin, the times of the vertical and transverse relaxation are discussed, and the spin temperature of the spins of the nucleus can be significantly different from the temperature of the grid because of the slow transfer of energy between spins and phonons. In terms of the intensity of the field, the system uses the mechanism of Coringa, and the temperature dependency is very close. The velocity of the relaxation is very dependent on the temperature, and the author thinks that the experimental the field dependency can be explained through the splitting mechanism, and but to explain that we need extra experimental data, and also the researcher points out local fields that are characteristic for of dipole character, and I think that the researcher makes a very important points that says that in the weak field that is compatible with the local field, there's a clear and very strong dependence of the velocity of relaxation on temperature, and I think that the defended statements are quite valid. But of course I have some critical points. The first one is the author uses samples with the thickness of 250 to 20 micrometers, refers them to microstructures, and so the question, what is the criteria of this classification? And because this is these are quite thick samples. And the second, when you study spin orientation of n-type, the values depend on the agitation, but all my points are more tend to be of a more discussion type character, and I think that the dissertation of Kotur Mladen on the topic low temperature nuclear spin-lattice relaxation totally conforms to the standards of St. Peter's State University, and Kotur Mladen totally deserve to be conferred on him the degree. Dissertation. The next reviewer talks about says that the dissertation of Mladen Kotur covers the topic, a very important topic, on a low temperature nuclear spin lattice excitation in n-GaAs Arsenide, and although the study of this nuclear spin relaxation is widely spread, and there are lots of works in the literature, but this deep analysis has not been done, and therefore this makes the work relevant for our research. It's very well known that the spin faculties of solid systems are quite complex for the study because of the hyper fine interaction between spins of the carriers of the charge and the nuclear that lead to the creation of a nonlinear electron nucleus spin system. And of course, the study uses a lot of data, and I think the conclusions are quite valid. All the results used a protocol, an original protocol of synchronic modulation of the values of intensity, of agitation of photoluminescent light, and also the magnetic field that is applied to it, and that provided the possibility to study the process of low temperature relaxation of the nucleus spin in gallium arsenide with the absence of optical agitation. And so the conclusions that are made on the basis of these results talk about the changes in the mechanism of nucleus spin relaxation and dependencies depending on the nuclear spin diffusion to quadrupole relaxation, when the external magnetic field becomes lower than the local field for dielectric samples in gallium arsenide, and also talks about the limitation of the band of values of the magnetic field where the Keringa theory is applicable for metallic samples, and so these conclusions are absolutely valid. Of course, I have some questions and comments, and of course they may be of technical character. The numbers of the chapters in describing the structures of this station on page 9 and 10 don't conform to their real numbers. Also in the review there are citations to publications, but only those publications where the values of parameters of theoretical models were taken. And I have some other comments, but nevertheless, my review is very positive, and I think that Kotur Mladen deserves the sword degree. The next review, please. The relevance of this topic. The relevance of this topic is derives from the importance of formation of the right ideas about the mechanisms of physical process and spin system of the solid body, and especially semiconductors, in which because of their electric qualities it is possible to see that concentration of free carriers of the charge in a very wide spectrum through the correct correct alloying is possible, and the presence of free carriers of the charge leads to additional channels of interaction between their spins and the spins of nuclear cores, and to the formation of nonlinear electron nuclear spin system with its specific qualities, which to date have not been understood at the qualitative level. The approach of the description of the results of the process in the samples that are absolutely different in the concentration of free electrons, as it is shown in the work, allows to identify new, hitherto unknown details of this process, which of course makes makes it possible to talk about the relevance of the experimental data for the field. And of course, this makes the contribution to this research, and the validity of the results and the conclusions that are presented in the work rest on the reproductivity of the results of the measurements and the assessments of experimental marginal errors, and also good agreement of experimental data with theoretically estimated values, and also with the compatibility of the data which are accrued through the use of photoluminescent method that is used in the work, and the method of measurements of spin noises that was applied and independent by another group of researchers on very similar samples. But I have some critical points as well. The dissertation has several drawbacks. For example, on page 4 it says it talks about optical orientation, but it doesn't say of what, of an electron, of the nuclear spin. On page 5 the phrase a dark relaxation at the absence of a beam with which is 20 MeV below the edge of the band, again doesn't make much sense. Also on page 6 T1 is not defined, and also on page 45, the term resistance per square also needs explanation. On page 45, the author makes a conclusion that there's conductivity, jumping conductivity that that is accompanied by the temperature dependency according to Mott law, but this is not demonstrated in any other way. It's not described with the use of a graph or in Mott coordinates, and this is the way that is usually done in this case. Nevertheless, my review is positive, and I think that the Mladen Kotur deserves the sought degree of the candidate of physics and mathematics. Thank you very much. The next review from my next colleague, Professor Shubina. I would like to say that
this dissertation is highly relevant and it is innovative for quantum optics. The dissertation by Mladen Kotur looks one of the most well-studied materials, which is gallium arsenide. The first research on this material dates back to 1972. However, the defendant has successfully implemented all the knowledge accumulated so far to explain an innovative effect related to the spin-lattice relaxation in semiconductors. I should highlight that the optic orientation and its research is a tool that allows us to calculate the effects of interaction between the nuclear spins and free electrons in strong and weak magnetic fields. The dissertation has a very logical structure. The introduction and the first chapter are the analytical overview of this problem, which looks at the background of this problem and its contemporary research. The second chapter describes the samples and the experimental setups with all the references. The two chapters to follow describe the original experiments and the models that describe and explain the results obtained. What makes it so particular is the comparison with the results in this field that are in other Russian and international laboratories. Sometimes this was a joint experiment, and this allows Mladen Kotur to develop a most comprehensive scope to analyze this phenomenon. The results are very clear and logical. They also describe the reasons behind quadrupole relaxation. The final chapter draws the conclusions. However, there are some drawbacks and points for criticism. Some of them have been already voiced so far. I would like to focus on the two most important aspects. One, the dependency between the spin-lattice relaxation and the time were explained by the dipole-dipole influence of spins. And this is explained by the dissipation of nuclear spin conditions. Chapters 2 and 5 claim that local fields are expressed depending on the nuclear polarization and the temperature at optical load. This allows us to validate the conclusion. Possibly, this would be a little bit beyond the initial scope of the dissertation. However, this should have been there. Next, the microstructure of the metallic sample is some way or other influenced by this, the observed phenomenon. This may be due to a number of specific properties that could be identified by way of X-ray diffraction, topographic maps, compensated light dissipation, and so on and so forth. This would have made this research even more comprehensive. Nevertheless, these points of criticism do not invalidate the results of the research. Those are merely recommendations. My overall expression is positive, and therefore I declare that the dissertation by Mladen Kotur, low-temperature nuclear spin-lattice relaxation in gallium arsenide, is in full fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Physics as per the relevant decree in awarding academic degrees in St. Petersburg State Universities, whereas Mladen Kotur deserves to be awarded the aspired academic degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Physics, specialty semiconductor physics. Next speaker is Mr. Verbin. A lot has already been said about spintronics and the key results of the research. I would like to broadly comment this issue. Why do I like this dissertation? Well, primarily this topic is highly challenging. And we should be daring to embark on such a topic. Because what researchers have been doing for 40 years already means that all simple questions are solved. What's more, it is well known that this is a non-linear, it is a highly complicated and challenging area because we have long times here. And it's very difficult to return this system into the initial state so as to repeat the experiment. So we have to have a very deep understanding about what's going on in the system. What have you done? So as to have adequate interpretation. What's more, in terms of theory, this is a highly challenging field as well, because it is not simple to structure a model of a nuclear system, because it is a non-linear system and it would result in a whole array of options and variants. And a theory man may just get disengaged by this. So this means that we have a full-fledged researcher who is very well learned both in practice and in theory. It is only iteration that allows us to think outside the box and to incur the electron gas regimes or low fields regimes with low concentrations where the dimer electronization starts to interfere. I believe that Mladen Kotur has successfully delivered on the objectives of the dissertation. This dissertation is highly comprehensive. It is very clear. It has a logical structure with very clear-cut conclusions to follow that allow us for a different interpretation of what is already well known. What was very unexpected for me is the impact of localization in the metallic sample of the dimer gas. And therefore, I have no points for criticism, but for some misprints that the previous speaker has already mentioned, my key recommendation is that localization, although its mechanisms are related to the donors. It is clear that the samples are volumetric and donors should be there. Therefore, such a standard way as to separate the localization from free samples would result in free electrons in gallium arsenide but without any localization on the donor. Have you considered such options and do you plan to move forward in this direction? And this is my key recommendation for the defendant. And just as a formal conclusion, may I declare that the dissertation by Mladen Kotur, low temperature nuclear spin-lattice relaxation in gallium arsenide, is in full fulfillment with the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Physics as per the relevant degree in awarding academic degrees in St. Petersburg State University, whereas Mladen Kotur deserves to be awarded this part academic degree in the field semiconductor physics 010410. Mr. Kotur, your replies to members of the dissertation board. Thank you so much. The first question was about why do we consider the sample a metric structure? Well, the answer is that there is a huge difference in the thickness of this sample versus the dielectric samples. And this was the key parameter to us. What makes this sample very different? It is a heterostructure. Next was about the power and the pumping. Here I analyzed the spin relaxation in darkness. Therefore, the ultimate pumping was not supposed to influence the relaxation process. However, everything was measured by the Hanle effect. And in this effect, the pumping and the power of pumping can impact the spin relaxation. Therefore, what we tried is to make the pumping power unchanged. That's it. My reply to Professor Yakovlev. Well, we did analyze the quantum hole of gallium arsenide. What we identified is that in darkness and in light, the time has changed, and the relaxation is different. The suppression of nuclear polarization in darkness in weak fields means that there is a warming up of the nuclear system due to the electric fluctuating fields via the quadrupole interaction. In case of pumping, these fields are shielded by photons, and the quadrupole channel shuts up. Next, commentary was by Professor. Next commentary by Professor Yakovlev. Yes, indeed, there was a mistake in the Russian version of the text. My next reply is to Professor Vivenko. As for the page 4, on page 4 I write about the optic orientation, and this is the optic orientation of the nuclei. As for the page 5 and the dark relaxation, what I meant here is that the spin noise method and the Kerov spinning are absolutely passive and non-perturbated. However, what we found out is that the beam should not agitate the spin system. We also found out that the probing beam resulted in the nuclear pumping by the probing beam. And the dynamic polarization to follow. On page 6, FOM means it is an abbreviation for the modulator. Once the field is changed from the measuring field to the dark field, what we saw, there was a lag or in time of 1 second between the signals. And this is just a mere mistake in the Russian version. What I meant here is that the relaxation time was less than the relaxation time measured. For example, in dielectric samples, this time is 50 milliseconds, whereas the shortest time measured was approximately 20 seconds, and it transformed up to 200 seconds at 100 Gauss. As for the resistance per the square, here I meant that this is the measured resistance of the fine fiber that in the material by way of the four-focus probing beam. Next, on this chart we see the dependency by the Monge law. Here I use the metallic phase, but I do not speak about the temperature when it is generated. The concentration in the metallic sample was higher than the critical one, and therefore the metallic phase for this sample is there for the entire temperature span from 2 to 30 Kelvin. My reply to Professor Verbin. Once again, there is a mistake in the dissertation. The dissertation has the introduction and 5 chapters. Those are the key principles of optic orientation, the experimental setup and the samples, the time for spin-lattice relaxation in dielectric gallium arsenide, the time of spin-lattice relaxation in metallic gallium arsenide, and the conclusion. In the overview chapter, I resorted to the book Optic Orientation, chapters 2 and 5, and Spin Physics and Semiconductors, chapter 11. And this is where I obtained all the data from. As for the length of the wave for dielectric sample is 818.3 nanometers, whereas for the metallic sample the wavelength is 816.0 nanometers. There is a mistake in the dissertation indeed, and thank you very much that you pointed at this mistake. And the last question was about the protocol. The key aspect of the protocol is that the pumping process, the relaxation and the polarization measurement are split in time. The first experiment was done by Vladimir Karevich in 1983. It was a similar experiment. Normally we use the principle of dynamic polarization of the nuclei in the inclined magnetic field, which is very well explained in Spin Physics and Semiconductors book. And the last question by Professor Shubina. Well, here I should say that in case of optic pumping, the nuclei are affected by the night field, and therefore measuring local fields cannot be obtained in such conditions. However, we applied the spin noise method, and our colleagues from St. Petersburg State University and Montpellier University observed increased local fields in microresonators, which were close to the value of 1.5 Gauss. And the last question by Professor Shubina. Well, I accept it, and thank you very much. It is a very valuable suggestion. Thank you. Thank you so much. Are all members of the dissertation board satisfied with the replies by the defendant, or do we have any other questions? Okay, no questions. Everyone is satisfied. Thank you. Now, my question is as follows. Is there anyone willing to take the floor from the members of the audience who are not members of the dissertation board? Has anyone registered? No, none has registered. No one wants to take the floor. Okay, then I would like to give the floor to the research supervisor of the defendant, Professor Kirill Kavokin. Thank you. Well, as it has been said already by several members of the dissertation board, the optic orientation of electrons and nuclei in semiconductors is something that has been initiated approximately 50 years ago, with gallium arsenide being one of the key samples to carry these experiments on and to study newly emerging phenomena. However, eventually we found out that there was an entire class of gallium spin arsenide. Gallium arsenide spins has not been studied, and this was our task. This was our objective. I had no clear understanding at that stage why spin relaxation has not been studied yet in these nuclei. But now it is clear it was highly challenging research. If you remember those curves that Mladen presented, each point of the dependency is just an entire curve showing the dependency between the nuclear field and the time span. Once the relaxation time at specific temperatures in specific magnetic field stands at 10 to 15 minutes, so as to register this curve, we need an entire work day. It is highly challenging to sustain the equipment within an entire work day. You need a lot of attention, you need a good understanding of the physics, of the technology, of the procedure. So over this time that Mladen was with us, he became a very well qualified researcher. He mastered how to operate the equipment, and he developed a lot of understanding in physics. Although his initial degree is not about semiconductor physics. And as a result, he came up with just an excellent research, which is indeed a breakthrough. Now we are having a huge project that brings together 4 organizations, including a research center in France. There is a set of successes apart from the Mladen's dissertation. But without Mladen, we would have failed to make this breakthrough. So Mladen did the initial stage, which is the most challenging, the most difficult task. And I believe that he deserves to be awarded the inspired academic degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Physics. Thank you. Well, according to the procedure, we have to make a very short break to discuss the dissertation within the members of the dissertation board and to come up with a final decision. Please switch off the broadcasting due to the procedure. And those who are not members of the dissertation board, may I ask you to leave the room for a very short time, so stay close.
We continue our session. Please switch on the microphone. And everything is working? Yes, okay. I'm tabling the question on open voting, for open voting on the awarding the sought degree. The Dissertation Council's decision is valid if 2/3 of the Dissertation Council members vote for it, according to the procedure that is part of the guidelines at St. Peter's State University. I'm calling on each member to vote. Yes, I vote for the conferral of the degree. I also confer I agree. I support the decision to grant the degree, and I also support the decision. Dear colleagues, dear guests, out of the 5 members of the Dissertation Council that participated, 5 voted for the decision, 0 members abstained, 0 members voted against. So the decision to grant the degree of kind of sciences and physics and mathematics in the specialty 10 physics of semiconductors. Conferral of this degree on Kotur Mladen has been taken. Thank you very much to all members of the Dissertation Council for the positive decision, and my great thanks to Mr. Kavokin, my scientific advisor, and everybody who supported me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President, for your attention, and I declare our session closed. Thank you.